And I should say that my name is Harriet O'Neill, and I'm Assistant Director for the Fine Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at the British School of Rome. And this is our third roundtable event in our Sustainability as Cultural Practice, Verbal and Visual Art, History and the Environmental Humanities series, which we've co-organised with UCL Cities Partnership Programme, and we're very grateful that we can work with them again under the auspices of the British Embassy, and this is part of the pre-COP26 activity taking place in Italy. It's been an absolute pleasure to organise this session in collaboration with Susan Collins from the Slade School of Art. So thank you, Susan, for everything and your advice, and it's been invaluable and it's very good to work together. And Marta Pellerini, who is the BSR's curator and fine arts advisor, who can't be with us this afternoon, but has been instrumental too. I should like to also say hello to the 66, potentially, student participants from the 16 U7 plus universities, which spread across 9 countries in Asia, Africa, North America and Europe. And they've been attending the events with great diligence. So thank you very much to them. So I mentioned that this is the third in our series of roundtables, and we have previously looked at how verbal art can inspire behavioural and policy change on a warming planet, with specific attention to the young. That was 2 weeks ago. And last week we thought about what we might learn from how past societies responded to climate change. But now it's the turn of our visual artists, who you can see on the screen here. So welcome to all our panellists. We have, and I'll just say it in running order, so each panellist is going to give a presentation. So we have Emma Critchley, Onya McCausland and John Gerrard. Then there'll be a 30-minute break, and 30-minute discussion and then a break, and then we'll pass over to Leone Contini and Hendry, and then there'll be further discussion time, about half an hour. And I'll introduce each panellist in more details, but I just wanted to say that the general aim of the panel is to explore how artists can flag, literally, John, we're hearing about flags, the importance of political action on climate change, and ask how its production can be both sustainable and engage with wider sustainability initiatives, especially in relation to communities and place. One vital question will be whether it is the proper role, indeed responsibility, of the artist to draw attention to the importance of political action on climate change, and think about whether policymakers listen. We'll also discuss whether and how artworks can change the minds of audiences. So before we begin in earnest, I just wanted to say to listeners that this event is being recorded, and you are really encouraged to type your questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and Susan and I will be monitoring those questions and asking them on your behalf. So our first speaker is Emma Critchley, who joins us from Brighton. We've identified that a number of us are surrounded by seagulls. Emma uses a combination of photography, film, sound installation to continually explore the human relationship with the underwater environment as a political, ecological and philosophical space. Of particular relevance to this afternoon's discussion was that in 2016, she was selected for a year-long residency, Culture and Climate Change, Future Scenarios, which culminated in the production of 2 major works, Common Heritage, which is a short film about the imminent threat of deep sea mining for rare earth minerals, and The Space Below, a public sound installation about underwater sound pollution. Also in 2019, Emma was the winner of the Earth, Water, Sky residency programme with Science Gallery Venice, where she has been working with the Ice Memory Project. The 2-screen film installation will be launched in the official Italian virtual pavilion in the Venice Architectural Biennale, with accompanying physical exhibition in Venice in late summer 2021. And we very much hope that Emma will be able to get to Venice for that. So thank you very much to you, Emma. I shall hand over the virtual stage and let you share your screen. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Harriet. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Before you disappear, Harriet, can you just let me know that you can see what I'm seeing?
Yes, I can see, yep, your slides, and then I can see the slides, individual slides on the left-hand side. Perfect.
Okay, great, thank you.
No, thank you.
So my work explores our human relationship with water from a philosophical, political and ecological position. Through film and sound installations, I invite the viewer into constructed environments that enable questioning from a place of experience. I work a lot with academics, and for me, art practice is able to draw attention to the importance of political action on climate change, as it can stimulate ways of thinking conceptually and analytically about the complexity and emotion within research. Art has the ability to provoke seeing, thinking, and feeling, and it is the feeling that enables a deeper engagement and understanding. Complexity is inherent to engaging with environmental change, and emotion is a core tenet of how people engage with nuanced and abstract problems. It is also a central part to the realities of living with environmental change and the research process itself. So the three projects I'm going to talk about today explore themes of flooding, deep sea mining and ice memory. And I've worked with communities in a few different ways through the project. So I'll talk through the projects and then, yeah, very much look forward to the discussion afterwards. So this first project is called They, and it was made with a human geographer at the University of Exeter, Dr. Catherine Butler. And she had a project called 2013 and 14 Winter Floods and Policy Change Project. So it was in response to the Somerset level floodings that happened that were very, very widespread and lasted a long time. And Catherine invited me to make a film as part of the research for this project, where they were conducting longitudinal interviews with people who'd been affected by the flooding. And they were examining perceptions of the problems and solutions to the flooding, and also individual and community resilience. So how the floods impacted on psychological well-being and quality of life. As Catherine says, too often the real meaning of flooding for people's lives are left out of policy and political discussion. She also said floods are both public and a deeply private affair. And this was something that I really engaged with, or was really interested in exploring in the project. So to start the project, I spent a long time listening to the interviews that they conducted over like a couple of years. And what became really apparent was how floods had left people living these semi-aquatic lives for long periods of time. And there was this real transformation of the familiar family home. And the interview narratives, there was kind of this common theme of many people feeling left very isolated and caught in this otherworldly, displaced world, which was juxtaposed with the fact that they became huge subjects of international media story. There's a lot of media generated around the floods. There was a lot of controversy about how and why the floods occurred, who was to blame, and for the scale and the duration of the flooding. And there was also this process of sense making that was articulated through the narratives of they and them, which the title of the film comes from, as people struggled to find agents of the events and the subsequent responses. So the idea that I came up with for the film was to, like inverted commas, reflood one of the houses that had been flooded and film the house through the reflection in the water's surface. So rather than thinking of it as a specific home, it was like representing the concept of home more generally as both a physical and psychological space. And through the water and the reflections, there was this sense of this estranged space and this alienated space. So a lot of people talked about how their homes sound was very prominent in the descriptions, because their sense of space was really transformed through it sounding completely different. The acoustics of the space really changed, and so yeah, that was used quite a lot in the film. So here you can see this is just a photo of us filming, so you can just kind of see how the film was made. So I'm going to play some of the film, just a few minutes of the film, and keep talking. So it's without the sound, but I just wanted you to get a sense of the film. And what it looks like. So through the piece, the camera is like this disembodied eye that moves through different rooms of the house. And initially, as you can see here, you're unaware it's a reflection. And as the film evolves, there are slow cues that evolve in the piece where you start realizing that what you're looking at isn't quite what you thought it was. As I said, sound was very important in the film. And as you move through the different rooms, I use sound to draw out different narratives that we'd kind of extrapolated from the interviews, like common themes, common points of controversy, or things that were important to people in the way that they responded. So in the first room that we go to, which we're going to enter in a minute, the kitchen, there's a helicopter. So the film has surround sound, and there's a helicopter that circulates the room as you kind of move through this space. And then you move into the living room, where you can hear David Cameron's infamous "No expenses spared" speech, which was again a huge bone of contention with a lot of people, as it was very much about too little too late. So he talks about no expenses spared, but a lot of the damage had already been done, and he didn't come down until very late in the day. And there's also the controversial floodline, which we recorded, we called up. And again, people talked about this, that it's meant to be this helpline to help people find support and where to go if their house has been flooded. But it was just this web of recorded voicemails, and you couldn't, it's really difficult to navigate. And yeah, so we recorded trying to get to a point in that, and that's kind of another of the audio narratives that you hear in the room. So I guess it's thinking about the failed systems that were prominent in how people's perceptions of their experience of the flood. So here, just to show you before we move on, it's where you start realizing that what you're seeing isn't perhaps what you thought it was, and the first drop of water is there in the film. And it sort of evolves as you go through the different rooms. So I was thinking about Ash's house when, like in the construction of the film, as it continuously turns in on itself. So there's this distorted sense of time, which was another thing in terms of the experience that people described, these really poignant descriptions of time standing still. And I just wanted to share the context of this talk, that it was like initially screened at a panel event at the Royal Geographic Society's annual conference, and the audience were made up of public and academics, research participants, but it also involved the Met Office, Public Health England, local county councils, the Somerset Council, the Environment Agency, DEFRA. So there's a real mix of audiences there. And just talking to Kat afterwards about, the process, the experience for her and working on it, she talked about how it was really important and useful for them in developing their analysis and opening up their thinking about the research. She says it facilitated our thinking about the impacts of the floods and enabled us to engage with the research materials in a different way, away from text and narrative towards a more visually emotive form of expression. So the next film I'm going to talk about, the next project, is called Common Heritage, and this is a short film which is part of a wider project that's still in development about deep sea mining for rare earth minerals. Very different project, different approach, but we're basically at a critical moment where we're about to start mining the deep, and it's completely, I think, under the radar, which is really at odds with the scale of the implications. So the film asks us to reflect on our past, to consider how we should move forward, and it questions the environmental and geopolitical implications. Excuse me. So it's very much about drawing attention to this pressing issue and having conversations. So this is a manganese nodule. This is a film still, which is one of the rare earth minerals that is going to be mined, that are being mined. And they're used as very much part of our modern day life. So the minerals are used for LCD screens, batteries, green technology. So they're very much part of everything we use today. The film is set around Arvid Pardo's speech to the UN in 1967, which is this, when I came across it, it was just a brilliant, evocative speech that could be written today. And it's really like a piece of sci-fi writing in a sense, because there's this grave warning. So the speech itself led to nearly 10 years of annual meetings at UNCLOS, which is the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, that was formed to have these meetings to draw up the Common Heritage of Mankind Treaty. Pardo talks about how he's noticed activities in the waters around his island of Malta, which is where he's from. Off the back of 2 world wars, it's the opportunity to bridge the gap between, in his words, developing and developed nations. So there's this huge, like it could save we could share the riches amongst the wealth of nations, and it could be an incredible moment. But he also warns of the grave consequences if it's not managed properly. And elements of the speech in the film are narrated by Gwyneth Jones, who's a science fiction author, and offers a female voice amongst the very male-dominated issues that you can see here. Dominated images, sorry, not issues, that you can see here. So the film uses, I worked with the National Oceanography Centre in Southampton, and it uses archives from their, sorry, I've just lost my, it uses archive footage from there, along with footage that I filmed myself in tanks, and it's got very, well, I tried to create evocative film and sound to kind of work like with science fiction tropes to kind of lure the audience through this kind of emotional journey. So it makes the point, so it's basically about questioning the fantasies that we build around these distant places. So it makes the point we're about to start carving up something that was once presumed infinite, and around which we've created this world of fantasy. And it also highlights the seeming impossibility of the task in our attempt to govern the ungovernable. To make the film itself, I consulted with many researchers, from NASA space law specialists, ocean law specialists, deep sea ecologists, philosophers, writers, but I also created a core community of scientists from University of Plymouth and the National Oceanography Centre in Southampton, who I consulted over a long period of time because they were very involved in what was happening and all the research that was happening. So that was the community, I guess, I was thinking that I connected with very much with this project. And throughout the film, there are these reoccurring scenes of two divers that kit up and descend into deep water as they kind of keep coming back in the film. So water here is used as an internal psychological space, questioning the activities that you see playing out. So it's a kind of pause, I guess, to the footage where you see the activities that are happening and the conversations that are happening. But they also talk about the inevitability of the situation. We are going there, but it's the importance of managing how we do that. And then the last project that I'm going to talk about is one Harriet mentioned at the end, called Witness, and this is I've just finished it, but it's not launched yet, and it was created on the Earth, Water, Sky residency with Science Gallery Venice. For this project, I spent a year researching with the Ice Memory Project scientists, who you can see here, primarily Professor Carlo Babanti at Cavostri University in Venice and his team. And the Ice Memory Project is a global initiative. They're creating an archive of ice cores from glaciers that are rapidly disappearing. So for those of you who don't know, that ice cores are this amazing archive of our climatic past. So as snow falls on glaciers, they collect the atmosphere particulate chemicals that are in the air. They're collected and fall with the snow onto the ice. And then as it becomes more and more compressed, these layers form in the deep into the glacier. And bubbles of air get trapped in the layers, and they, like, inside those bubbles are ancient atmospheres, which is just like really quite incredible. And this is what the scientists are analysing to build pictures of our climatic past, and that also helps predict our future. So the film is a 2-screen installation, and the premise of it is the examination of an ice core as a post-mortem of a glacier. So it's thinking about the glacier as being witness to environmental and societal events that have led up to its death. And it sets up the interplay between, interplay between the human body and the body of a glacier. So the glacier here is very much an animate body that holds memories. And it came from the discovery that when a glacier is no longer moving, so it doesn't have enough, accumulate enough mass to be moving down the mountain, it's classified as dead. And most glaciers in the world are now classified as dead, which is just a really shocking fact that I didn't know before. So this is kind of the key point that I wanted to respond to. So the work is a collection of different forms of knowledge. It's a meditation on the multiple narratives of ice, the interconnectivity of everything, whether it's sentient or not, and the non-linear nature of history. So unlike the layers in an ice core, history is not linear, and it very much depends on who's telling the histories, from when, what point they start. So it's, I really wanted to kind of draw attention to this. And so there's a spoken word over the film that weaves together conversations. The film generally weaves together conversations, scientific papers and articles, interviews with people who live local to glaciers, and my own thoughts and reflections. It thinks about different ways of knowing, from scientific to lived experience, and it's which are expressed through spoken word, movement, and music. The process of making the work was really important. It was quite long and important, and to me it was really important that it was a collective response, not just from my own personal perspective. So it was brought together through workshops and conversations. So I had a lot of conversations with ice core scientists around the world. I filmed scientists analysing the cores that appear in the film. But I also remotely did interviews with people living with glacial retreat on a daily basis. So here you can see in Peru with Cortilia Blanca in the background with the Andes. We also interviewed people in Kenya living close to Kilimanjaro. And these interviews feed into a libretto that accompanies the film, and the interviews they're both woven into the film, but they also act as witness statements to support the film. I conducted narrative workshops, thinking about the process of meaning making of scientific data by analysing and inhabiting the data. So making meaning through narrating, through storytelling, using this as a process of understanding, and unpicking the complexity and diversity of the issues. I also worked with dancers, because I wanted to film dancers underwater. That was kind of one of the key things that I wanted to develop, thinking about the body being suspended in water, like the air within the ice cores that's telling these narratives. So we did dance workshops, which were also auditions out of water in Bassano, and then in Y40, which is the deepest pool in the world, indoor pool in the world, which is just outside of Venice. So I used the workshops to discuss and develop the research, or respond to the research, I should say, in movement, through movement. And they were really experimental and playful, and it was fantastic for me as a real antidote to a lot of the papers that I was reading. So I kind of really got quite entrenched in all of the scientific papers, and it really helped me to think creatively again. So this is Y40, which is, like I said, is the deepest indoor pool in the world. And I was really interested, I particularly wanted to film here. They partnered on the project because the core, this volume of water, architecturally, the column of water reflected the ice cores. So it was particularly important to me to work in this space. So after we did the auditions, we selected 2 dancers and a freediver, and gave the dancers a workshop, a training, in freediving. So they did their equivalent of a paddy open water in freediving. And then we had a week working with choreography in the pool, responding to this, to the narratives that I'd drawn out in the spoken word that I was writing about. And we developed choreography and movement, and that kind of fed into the film. And so, yeah, as Harriet was saying, so it's got its first screening on Saturday, just a little mini plug very quickly. On Saturday the 24th, it will be shown in the Italian Pavilion at the Architecture Biennale. It's being screened for a day, and we're doing an introduction, and then it then becomes hosted in a virtual pavilion in the Architecture Biennale, and then it will have its own exhibition in August, September time in Venice, and there'll be more details on the Science Gallery Venice website. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was wonderful. And I'm sure our audience have questions to ask you. So I please do send them into the Q&A function. What we're going to do is have each of the presentations and then bring the discussion together as a group discussion. So I'd like to invite Onya Onya McCausland to make herself visible while I introduce her. I should say that Onya is an artist and senior research fellow at the Slade School of Fine Art. Works by Onya McCausland have been shown widely in solo and group exhibitions around Europe. And she describes her work as interrogating relationships between painting and contemporary landscape. And we're going to hear more about that now. So Onya, if you'd like to share your screen, that would be wonderful.
Thank you. Sorry for the little blip there. Okay, thank you for the invitation to talk about this particular piece of work, which is something that's been ongoing for a few years now. Is my sound okay? Is that effective?
Yes, it is perfect, and the screen is very clear too. So
great,
yeah,
great. Thank you very much. I'm going to put a link in the chat, if I can, after the talk, which is a link to the website from which this work will is kind of speaking. But I also wanted to say that I wanted to sort of start somewhere slightly odd, which is here. And the reason is that I'm going to be talking about ochre, an earth pigment that I've been working with, which is part of the recycling of mine waste. But it kind of goes back to this particular work, which was, this is a drawing made from earth pigment that I found in an iron ore mine in the Forest of Dean in 2007. I was doing residency at Gloucester Cathedral, and I discovered like traces of red left on the cathedral walls, and the walls were stripped right back, and the only trace was this red. So during the Reformation and iconoclasm, all the images were stripped off the walls, and this was just the trace that was left. And this colour spoke of it was the only visible sign of a very visceral, charged and complex history that was beyond the otherwise bare cathedral walls. And this is the place where this material came from, which is an iron ore mine just not far from the cathedral. But the other really interesting thing about this iron ore mine is that it's a very high quality earth colour, and it's been being mined for a millennia. It was apparently the very best ochre that you could find, and apparently it's rumoured to be used on a famous ceiling in Rome. So I thought I had to mention that. It's known as Terra Rossa Inghilterra, English red earth, and that's it on the wall of Gloucester Cathedral. So actually, kind of this sort of triggered an interest in the potency and power of pigment, colour in painting as a means to speak about things that go way beyond the immediate visible appearance. The other thing that I just want to mention about red earth, and it is completely connected, is a material that's got a sustained use in human history and prehistory. The red earth that we know as an earth material, so it's humble in a sense. It's so I'm just going to flick my screen over there because I want you to see the colour rather than me, if that's okay. Yeah, so it's a humble, lowly material. It is humus, as in ground. So ochre, and especially red ochre, has a symbolic and mystical meaning in many cultures around the world. So, and it is used in ritual, and part of that is to aid the passage between life and death.
So it's blood-like properties of the dust, and that we all end up returning to in the end. Anyway, so I'm here really to talk about Six Bells Red, which is this new pigment that I've discovered that, while materially related to these other pigments, iron oxide pigments, has completely different history, context, completely different function. I will drop in the odd image of a painting as I go along. That's not because I want to talk about individual paintings particularly, but because they all form a part of like my accumulating knowledge of the material. So they're also another vehicle for my imagination. So they're kind of useful, sort of visual kind of prompts, really. Six Bells is a small former coal mining village in Blaenau Gwent, in South Wales, tucked in the shadow of a mountain, deep in the valleys. And 50 metres below the old miners' pub, the Coach and Horses, are this geometric configuration of layers of fields, of holes, chambers and shafts. All this hidden evidence of around 200 years of the extracted coal sediments. The colliery here closed in 1987, and about 5 years after that, the Ebware Fat River turned bright orangey red. When the mines were dug, they descended deeper than the water table. So the flood water had to be pumped out for the mines to be worked. So the pits, when the pits closed, those pumps stopped working, and the cavities, all those tunnels and spaces underground, slowly filled up with water. After that period of that delay of a few years, the water started to brim up and spill to the surface, and this is the result. These carrying iron minerals that have been dislodged from the cut walls of the mine tunnels and then released into the floodwater, and they eventually get carried to the surface like this. And so that's the reason that the river turns orange, because it's carrying this load of minerals unlocked from the geology underground. This is Six Bells mine water treatment site, and it's built to divert and treat that polluting mine water before it reaches the river. So the pumps that kept the mines dry in the beginning, so they could be worked, had to be switched back on to treat the polluting mine water. So the river's no longer orange anymore, and this mine water treatment scheme is really the only visible sign of that vast hidden architecture underground. It's fenced off and partly screened, but it basically sits in the heart of the village. The water is going to flow through these mines now endlessly. The levels will rise and fall as weather conditions and climatic variations change, but the water will keep flushing through the miles of workings, picking up mineral residues along the way. There are now about 80 of these mine water treatment sites across the UK, and they treat 122 billion litres of mine water every year. So the sites capture the mine's pollution, which forms an ochreous iron sludge. That's the dissolved pyrite salts that have been dislodged in the geological leftovers underground that are carried up in the floodwaters. They gradually develop into a colour. I'm just going to go back actually. They develop into a colour as they meet oxygen in the air. So they're oxidising on contact with the surface. So this colour is a sign of particles of iron actually forming in time. And these settling lagoons allow these oxidizing particles to fall, sink by gravity, separating from and clearing the polluted water. So actually, this is a diagram of the way that you would leveragate pigments and divide their physical properties by coarse, medium, and fine. The mine water treatment sites actually inadvertently perform this function anyway. So this process of organising material, facilitating chemical changes, and the resulting accumulation of matter looks to me like an ochre factory. When I arrived here in 2015, all 5,000 tons, there were about 5,000 tons of iron residues produced by the mines every year. That was all sent to landfill. So the environmental management of this material, which is dealt with by the Coal Authority, with whom I currently work, sort of, I'll explain a bit more about that later. It's an industrial scale land pollution remediation program, and it will go on for decades or hundreds of years. Yeah. And yet, as these iron oxides in the sedimenting tanks are also an inadvertent and unavoidable pigment production site, these paintings were a kind of means to sort of visualize how that sedimentation occurs underneath, unseen beyond the water's surface. So I suppose I think of these sites as also being possible. It's possible to see them as a monochrome watercolor painting, kind of lying in the ground. And my work over the last 7 or 8 years, has been to find out ways to divert the waste material from landfill and find ways to articulate some of the complexities of the landscape and the environmental and ecological paradoxes underway here. So I'm working both as an artist, but also in collaboration with the Coal Authority, the Environment Agency, and DEFRA, increasingly, and also DEFRA. So I've made, I won't talk about that painting, but it is a means to think about transparency and pigment particle coarseness and fineness, and how pigment and paint works, but also to do with how we perceive space and concepts in different ways. So this is a tin of Six Bells Red, which is what I'm here to talk about, and it is made with pigment from Six Bells mine water treatment site that's been burned to achieve a red colour. So it's been burned from yellow to red, and as far as I know, it is the first sustainable mineral-based exterior grade wall emulsion paint made from 100% recycled ochre pigment. I don't know of any other anybody else who's done this. The waste streams of iron that force their way up to the surface depict the event below ground. The ochre is a trace of the invisible fading memory of a community, and the ochre is linked to the climatic catastrophe we are now experiencing. The mines beneath these now lush green valleys were the first industrialized coal mines in the world, worked for hundreds of millions of tons of coal. At the turn of the last century, more coal was extracted in this 2,500 square kilometers of land than any other place on Earth. Fueling furnaces that directly accelerated the expansion of British colonial rule and the injustices and exploitation that it supported. South Wales was supplying nearly all the coal that was exported for use in Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, West Africa, India, Middle, Far East, Atlantic USA, West Indies, Peru, Chile, Pacific USA, East Africa, France, and the Mediterranean. Cardiff and Barry Docks were the world's largest outlet for coal exports, so materially linking Welsh coal to the British imperial presence around the world, and literally providing the energy behind the pursuit of capital, land, people, and resources from across the British Empire, underpinned by deregulated, unequal free trade arrangements. The echoes of Brexit here, but they kept down export costs, making imports cheap, and Welsh labour costs low. Six Bells in the valley of Blaenau Gwent, South Wales, became part of this rapacious, inexhaustible extraction, and was among the first, it was among the last of the mines here to close in 1987, and the trauma that occurred in 1987, the miners' strike. The consequences of that abrupt end are still playing out now in the economic and social inequalities of this community's experience. Once grounded in the non-conformist self-reliance, independence and pride, this region is now statistically one of the poorest in Europe, in the UK and in Europe. So just as a means to kind of reinforce this jeopardy, in 2017, the International Institute for Sustainable Development commissioned a case study examining consequences and legacies of the coal mining mono industry in South Wales, providing a sort of insight and guidance to Shaanxi province in China about the impending economic and social consequences of the closure of the collieries for an area 60 times larger than South Wales. The report is an account of the effects. I'm just going to quote a couple of quotes from the report. The local economy, this is in South Wales, the local economy is no longer sustainable, and a spiral is generated in which economic collapse and social deprivation outstrip the resources and capacity to adequately respond. To date, regional policy objectives to generate new business and employment throughout the valleys have not succeeded in counteracting the loss of employment or staunching the overall population decline. As former miners and the mining community age, memories of the mining industry are fading. The local towns were built as a result of this expansion of the industry, and with the closure of the mines, loss of identity and loss of self-esteem become endemic. This soft green valley actually belies the damage imposed under the ground and beyond in the wider global environment, but also the loss of culture, connection and community that was both generated by and destroyed through the intensive mining. And paradoxically, the sites themselves hold in balance the functioning of pollution control alongside the incidental, ecologically diverse habitat that the sites themselves become. I've got to get the Greeks in here. So the Greeks called iron oxide or rust antipathia, meaning opposite nature. It wounds and it heals. It symbolizes life and death at the same time. So the iron rising at Six Bells carries the memory of the mines and the history of the place, as well as containing a warning about the future. I'm just going to quote from Howell Clatworthy, who is now one of the co-directors of Turning Landscape. I'll talk about that in a sec. But he spoke very movingly at the launch of Six Bells Red in December 2020. He said, both my grandparents were miners. They spent much of their working day below ground, but I can no longer go to the places to remember them. The buildings they worked in are also gone. Many of the beautiful public buildings they were so proud of and were educated in are also gone. Sometimes it feels that we are demolishing and burying their memory. My grandfather's bodies bore the physical scars of life underground. As a child, I was fascinated by their hands and arms, where coal had literally got under their skin and stayed there after an injury had healed. As I get older, I realize that the scars on the landscape are nearly as precious to me as the scars on my grandfather's bodies. I want to be able to repeat the stories these scars hold to my children and grandchildren. So yeah, RHUL is one of the co-directors of this small company that is, it's a community interest company, a KIC, which is now based in Six Bells, which turns this ochre waste into paint. And Six Bells Red is the first of a series of paints that will be launched across different sites in the UK over the next few years. Yeah, there's 5,000 tons of iron waste produced by the mines every year, and it's managed by the Coal Authority. But you know, it's going to go on for forever. And the Coal Authority are responsible for the management of the old mines and the environmental legacy they have, and they're keen to capitalise on opportunities. So there's a kind of danger here that Six Bells is taken up by some large, I don't know, pigment producer corporation, and the waste becomes re-commodified, capitalised, re-exploiting an already exploited community instead of being used as a vehicle for memory, for imagination, for education, and for insight. So I'm working with the former miners and the local community to make the paint at Six Bells. So it crucially embeds the paint with the site and the place that it comes from. Because there's a crucial question here, which is who owns this ochre? Is it still waste now that we have given it value? When is waste waste and no longer waste? The material, once turned into paint, becomes a tool. It speaks and establishes new narratives. We can maintain and grow this company into a model of sustainable making. I want to talk, I just want to mention Rashid Areen, who I've been really kind of thinking about a lot recently, because you know, this is far from sort of virtue signaling, which is there's a danger of it being perceived as that, because it's for in my view, for art to remain as an expression of human hope, and this is quoting Rashid, for art to remain as an expression of human hope, it must liberate itself from bourgeois individualism and enter life's collective, everyday, creative energy. He goes on to say that, and this conjecture of individual imagination remains meaningless unless it enters the public domain and becomes part of a collective. So, yeah, I mean, I make work in my studio alone, and the paintings are part of thinking things through. But the real work is finding a way to apply and share these ideas that form through this creative space. And yeah, individual paintings and markers rather than endpoints. So I'm gonna kind of race through these, well, not race through these images. Now, as I come to an end, these are the mining surveyors who actually made the maps of underground. So we have this business model, and it's based on the material staying where it is and benefiting where it is, and going in, making a genuine circular economy. That is the ochre being burnt from yellow to red to make the red ochre, and the significance of the red ochre I touched on at the beginning. So Six Bells Red is the exterior grade wall emulsion, and Six Bells Burnt Ochre, which I haven't mentioned, is a 40mm tube of oil paint made with Michael Harding in his Cwmbran factory in South Wales. It's coincidental that his I don't know if it's coincidental, his factory is 13 miles away from Six Bells mine water treatment site. So he made 1,000 tubes of oil paint, and I will put this link in the chat line because both the oil paint and the wall emulsion are for sale, and you can buy them from the website, and all profits will be recycled back into making more paint and ensuring that the project stays local and sustainable. And I'm just going to end with this plaque, which was installed on Six Bells mine water treatment site. And it was a sort of surreptitious, well, it wasn't surreptitious, it was quite obvious way of claiming the site for the project and for the kind of future, really. And it was nice the way it started to oxidize very quickly. And this is the team, the director's team. And I will end there. Thank you very much.
So I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you so much, Onya, by the way, for that great presentation. And I think there's going to be so much to talk about. There are already lots of cross references between yours and Emma's, and lots of things to pull out. And talking of mining, I'm very delighted to introduce John Gerard. He's best known for his sculptures, which typically take the form of digital simulations displayed using real-time computer graphics. Through reference to his own practice, John will discuss the role of art in the public domain, its potential to alter audiences' perceptions of the world, including the environment. And he's going to discuss two works, Western Flag, which provoke conversations around CO2 legacy and the historic burden of 20th century petro-modernity, and Cornwork, an exploration of agriculture as a coordinated machine of dominance and, by extension, violence. So over to John.
Thank you very much, Susan. Sorry we don't have Harriet. Onya, that was absolutely wonderful. I want to run out and get some red ochre paint immediately. And also thanks to Emma. It's beautiful work, beautiful, and such a deep engagement. It's really, really beautiful to learn of it. Also, Emma, thank you very much for your presentation. So as Susan has outlined, I'm going to talk about a commission from Channel 4 in 2017, which was called Western Flag. I'm going to outline, the logic behind that work and, what it became. I'm going to briefly touch on, Harriet specifically wanted me to talk a little bit about NFTs, which is a controversial subject in ecological terms, but I think it's still nonetheless an important one. And then I'm going to move on to talk about Cornwork, which is a commission for Galway City in Ireland, commissioned for they were the cultural capital of Europe in 2020, and then COVID hit them. So we're just opening parts of that project now, very, very delayed. So sharing my screen, remembering to share sound and doing this. And I think you should all be able to see that as far as I'm aware. Can I just get a little signal that that you guys can see that?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
So Western Flag Spindletop 2017, commissioned by Channel 4. And that work began with this image, which is a historic image from 1935 of the very first major oil strike in world history. Which was at Spindletop in Texas. Someone called Lucas adjusted a water drill, drilled far deeper than ever before, and this extraordinary 50-meter jet of oil jumped out. And it dwarfed all the oil production. The sort of shallow oil production on the east coast of America was dwarfed by this one strike. It was 100,000 barrels of oil were released a day, and it took them about 9 days to cap it. So that's 1901 Spindletop, Texas, the very first big oil strike in world history. And this is 1902, so it's the next year. And I always found this image incredibly redolent of what happened, what oil achieved, these extraordinary cities that just leapt up across the world in the 20th century. And I was just very interested in this archive of material to do with Spindletop and the birth of, as I said, big oil. So this is called Oil Alley, and kind of incredible documentation. So this is Spindletop now. So all the oil was extracted. The landscape actually physically collapsed, was flooded. to unflood it. And when I was approached by Channel 4, I had been thinking about this site for a couple of years. And I proposed to John Hay, who was the commissioner from Channel 4, that I would react to the space in the context of less what it achieved, because oil transformed military endeavors, transformed transport, completely transformed agriculture. I wanted to less recall those kind of, human triumphs and focus a little bit more on the legacy of the strikes, which was carbon dioxide, which is of course invisible. And, it was not so well known. It might be slightly better known now, but a percentage of the CO2 released by the strike in Spindletop is still in the atmosphere. This is why CO2 concentrations are building up in the atmosphere. So this was my sketch of concept for a revealing flag, or a flag which would recall the carbon legacy of Spindletop. And this was after around about a year of work. This was the result, which is a portrait of the site made in a game engine, made in real-time 3D in a game engine, augmented by a piece of custom coding, which is a volumetric smoke simulation. So I meet people frequently who talk about this as a film, but this is actually a real-time simulation which unfolds over a year. So the sun rises in this scene, travels over, goes down. You have day cycles, seasonal cycles in light terms. So it's actually a game engine based work. So Channel 4 commissioned it as a television intervention. Well, that was my proposal actually, that it would intervene into TV on Earth Day across the UK, 2017. And so this is a glimpse of that intervention. It happened 2 or 3 times an hour. And it was a hard cut into TV. There was no announcement that it would happen.
Back in North Devon, Emily, her builder Dave and his team have been busy stripping out the kitchen, including the ceiling. The traditional lath and plaster is one period feature that just hasn't stood the test of time.
So that happened 2 or 3 times an hour over 24 hours on Earth Day 17. So you're watching TV, watching your home decorating show or whatever it is, and suddenly you lose that flow of entertainment. And I thought of it as a kind of an interruption, almost like a flood, that your kind of, your familiar comforts of entertainment are interrupted. And instead you have this, this threatening symbol of a flag of smoke. So we also got to install the work upon a light emitting diode wall in Somerset House for 1 week. So it was 1 day on TV, 1 week in Somerset House, and it was a live stream via YouTube for a month. So to try and touch a global audience. And the work, what I love about working, particularly in the public domain with LED walls, is that you get all sorts of different publics. I mean, this is not quite on the street because you have to come into Somerset House to get to it, but it's open night and day across all sorts of different conditions, and lots of different types of publics can come to the work. And one of the things that happens often when you put works like this in the public domain, this is it in the evening in Somerset House, is that people walk up to it and they actually put their hand on the LED wall and they sort of almost kind of join the work. They want to kind of interrogate this medium, which is actually originally an advertising medium. So eventually 2 little people are going to walk up here. 1 second. Yes. So this is quite typical that people walk up to the work, put their hands upon it and kind of touch the LED. And in so doing, what I like is that they kind of enter the world of the work in a funny way. So it becomes like a form of kind of, not quite interaction, but it really becomes a type of public work. So the work was picked up by different sort of organizations. This is Desert X in California, which is a biennale on the landscape in the Coachella Valley in California. And so we put the work in the desert for, in Palm Springs, which is like the epitome of sort of petro-driven American luxury lifestyle. We put this kind of legacy flag in the desert in Palm Springs, which was an interesting experiment. which you can see here, where in a way the two landscapes began to communicate with each other. More shots from Desert X. This is also an image from Desert X. I just also want to say that we support the LED wall from behind. So it's a sort of a perfect sort of frameless intervention in the landscape that, you know, that you have no frame around the image. It's almost as if you cut a hole in the scene and you have this underlying reality. And that's an important, strategy for me. So the work was acquired by TBA21, Thyssen-Bornemisza Art of the 21st Century, which is an international collection headed up by Francesca Thyssen-Bornemisza. And this is her father's donated museum in the city of Madrid. And so Francesca brought Western Flag from her collection to Madrid for the COP25 last year. So it became part of the climate discussions in Madrid, and where I sort of met a very sort of interesting group of people. Here you can see a small child sort of addressing the work in the rain, actually, as it happens. So Harriet asked me to touch on this, which is a 30-second extract, a video. It's an MP4, which loops endlessly, and which was released as an NFT, a single NFT on the platform Foundation on March 20th, 2021. And I did this for two reasons. I mean, first of all, it was a protest in a way, because I was, I guess, sort of offended that the digital was being so dominated by this idea of transaction, you know, that the artist Beeple sold one of his whatever collage things for $68 million. And this was somehow indicative of art of any sort. So I released this work as a kind of a protest, and I attached two concepts to it. One was that 50% of artist proceeds would go to support regenerative and biological farming in Ireland. That was one layer to the release. And the second layer was that the 1 ton of CO2 that the NFT released in being minted would be offset within soil sequestration, you know, a soil sequestration endeavor at a cost of $100 per ton, alongside any coins that might have been used to purchase the work. So it was a kind of two-sided approach to try and address like the potential of the NFT space, but also link it with environmental concerns, and also to address head-on some of the ecological concerns, which I'm sure some of you will want to talk about in more detail, and which I'm open to discussing. Okay, so jumping on to Cornwork, which is the last piece I'm going to talk about. Cornwork really begins here with a river. And this is a river in the center of Galway. I'm going to let that run for a second. So Cornwork began with a river in Galway, and this river historically turned great wooden wheels of grain mills, dozens of them in the center of Galway. All the local agricultural areas would bring their grain and it would be milled using this very, very powerful river. And that entire sustainable infrastructure of food processing, grain processing, has been completely dismantled. So the river runs through the city really as an untapped sustainable power source. And so I wanted to come to this key, which is called Claddagh Quay, and to augment it with the work which would talk on the one hand about grain, on the other hand about the idea of a wheel, and finally, really about the idea of agriculture, as Susan mentioned, as a kind of coordinated system of kind of total dominance in a way. So it's kind of like a two-sided work. On the one hand, it talked about like sustainable histories of agriculture, because we do have to eat. And on the other hand, it talked about agriculture as a kind of something of a kind of monstrous entity that is grinding all in front of it. So local to Galway, you have these traditions where mostly men, but sometimes women, would dress themselves in straw, and these are the corn boys, and they would turn up to weddings often and be badly behaved and steal the bride and drink whiskey and such things. This is an old Irish tradition whose origins are not really known. But I always linked it to the idea that pre-petroleum, before food could be moved very rapidly and very cheaply around the world, you were at the mercy of your food supply. If your food supply might fail, you would go hungry. And I always felt that Ireland, you know, in its transition from, you know, perhaps more shamanic pre-Christian traditions, you know, when the Christian traditions were laid over those historic belief systems, the Christian belief system was not laid as effectively as elsewhere. So there's these kind of points in Ireland where that interplay between kind of human powers and non-human powers, like the power of the landscape, the power of water, the power of plants which sustain us, you know, and those kind of historic, you know, pagan shamanic traditions which intersected with those entities, you know, which were appeased or in some way engaged with. In Ireland, you know, these corn boys, they are subsuming themselves in a food landscape, in covering themselves like this. They're subsuming themselves in a sustaining landscape. And if you look closely at the helmets that they wear, you have the 4 wheels of the year: spring, summer, autumn, winter, which is also, in a way, a solar wheel. It's also, you know, kind of pointing to what eventually became the Christian cross. But I think that this kind of the 4 wheels of the year is a much earlier solar symbol or solar sign. So I grew up in Ireland, about an hour from Galway in Southern Ireland. And I worked with a local artist, wonderful crafts person called Gerard Wisdom. And she looked very closely at this construction, and she recreated it. So she wove straw, which is of course sun-colored, to form these plaits. And then we remade the 4-pointed helmet from the corn figure. So this is actually me in my father's farmyard, dressed up as a straw boy. But I became a very kind of melancholy, sad, maybe slightly overweight corn boy. And then to make the piece, we worked with the 4 historic grains of Ireland, which is barley, oats, wheat, and rye. These are the really ancient original grains of the land, which we had to cut by hand, because if it went through the harvester, it would damage the straw. So, and here we are developing these characters to become kind of part of the work. So I'd said earlier on that the piece responded to a river, and in that river was a mill wheel, like a wooden wheel turning, which would then in turn turn a mill wheel, which would grind the corn. And this is actually none of those things. This is a very early solar sign. So a circle bisected by a cross is a symbol of the sun in multiple world cultures. And again, the Christian religion picked up on the solar wheel to become the Christian cross in time. But this historically is more closely associated with the representation of the sun. So we mapped out these kind of solar signs on the floor of a studio, as you can see here. And this is a wonderful, wonderful dancer. I don't actually know exactly which one it is here, but one of a group of 4 dancers. I'll tell you in a minute who it is. And here she's wearing a motion capture suit, and she's pacing this solar wheel on the floor of the studio, which you can see here. So this is a virtual representation of that straw suit. We've built it again as a virtual object. And this performance is being produced by a dancer, which you'll see now in a moment. So here you can see the dancer in the background performing. Oops, we'll just wait a minute. You can see the dancer performing in the background, and just to confirm which dancer it is Ursula Robb. This is Ursula Robb, and she's performing this relentless circular walk, which speaks both about these histories of sustainable production in Ireland, but also about, as I said before, agriculture as a kind of relentless coordinated system of dominance, really, over the non-human world. So this is the eventual capture that we, this is a virtual straw suit remade virtually, which I actually should have underlined more. And then we brought the virtual suit into a portrait of the landscape in Galway on Claddagh Quay. And so this is a video of the installation. So it's an LED wall on the quay, a portrait of the place virtually, this place, this quay, and overlaid with these virtual straw figures, which we spent about 1.5 years working on. And they're performing this ambiguous wheel. They're walking the wheel. And here members of the public are interacting with the piece, as you can see here. I'm just gonna let it run for a moment so you can see it. And we developed a language. In this case, this is a spring moment. We developed a language where, actually, no, this is autumn, where there's sort of harvesting. There's a language of harvesting, because there was 4 seasons within the work: spring, summer, autumn, winter. Each of the seasons had a different grain, and each of the seasons had a different dancer. So, and here you can see the work housed within a mirrored pavilion, which provided a portrait of the site in which it was. And again, a member of the public is interacting with it. And what I like here is that you've got this sense that the river was driving the wheel. And actually, we worked with a group of energy providers locally that provided sustainably generated power only from this area for this work to exist. So, and again, this is public art. It's open 24 hours a day, and completely diverse publics can come to the work in the night, as you can see here, and see the performance in the nighttime. So just to say, the second part of that commission, which is called Leaf Work, will open in Galway, in Connemara, on August 28th. And I'm not going to talk too much about that, but it's again an LED wall upon a mirrored pavilion. And I'm working with a dancer called Finola Cronin, and she will produce a lament, again, a circle, a lament for what I think of as a kind of a heating world. So she's a singular older female dancer who's producing this lament, which you can see being produced here. I'll just let that run for a moment. And then as the day goes on, she becomes more and more fatigued. So this leaf-covered figure becomes more and more fatigued in the finished work. So that is about it. I'm going to stop sharing. I am going to say thank you very much to Susan and Harriet for including me, and that's it from me.
I think we have Harriet back.
Yes, I'm back, and I hope, can you hear me? Yes, oh great.
Hi, Harriet.
Hello, sorry, my computer went a little awry, so I'm at a different office, and thank you for persevering. And we've still retained, you've managed to keep talking, which is brilliant, and the audience kept on talking as well. I don't know if Emma and Onya would like to make themselves visible, because we can now invite questions from the audience. If you would like to send in your questions. But first of all, thank you for the presentations. We grouped you in, there was a logic to our groupings. We were thinking that Emma and Onya, and actually Joe, you were talking about mining, and we thought that on a sort of simple level would get people talking. But I was also struck by this shared interest in water, in placemaking, in memory, and then also thinking about the technologies that Emma is looking at, sort of the deep sea mining, and then John's use of those technologies. So I wondered, for the 3 artists that were speaking, whether you felt that there was, where you felt that points of discussion were between you, and whether you took anything from each other's presentations. And then I'd like to ask about community and exhibition space.
I would perhaps say that, particularly in relationship to what Onya presented, it's just a very interesting extension of the idea of public art, you know, that you have this sort of deep engagement with histories of mining. and histories of mitigating the damage that mining produces. And then as a result, you have, a pigment which you can use, which you can live with, you can paint. And it's just a very, I think it's a really interesting extension of histories of public art in a way, literally into the public domain, into the private domain, into people's homes, Mm-hmm. And I just would love the idea that you could almost work on a kind of a rainbow set of pigments globally with all these tailing ponds, sort of, if you were to engage them, you could end up in a kind of a series of hues, which are both kind of, complicated project. I thought it was great.
Mm. Thank you. I mean, I think that's exactly the ambition for the work, is for it to become a collective public piece, that people are taking pieces of this material away into different pockets of the country, of the world, and they can kind of do what they like with it, but it becomes like a kind of trigger. And I like the kind of unwieldiness of that as well, of kind of not knowing what happens to it, and kind of not being in control of it, not being kind of not monitoring what happens, and maybe perhaps inviting people to kind of loop back into the project if they feel like it, but it's not, it's not obligatory. There's this, I think I was kind of interested in your work for a reason of its, because it is like a wall, a public-facing wall of the image, which kind of acts visually directly on the public, and that's what I really like about it, and I really enjoy the clarity and the kind of simplicity and directness of it, but also then of course the way that it's looping back into an archaic and deeply kind of ritualistic sort of set of concerns, which which I'm really interested in also, but forming through a different route.
I mean, jumping a little bit, pulling Emma in, there is a funny tension, because I firmly believe that we should work as artists with the materials which are available now, and that we have to acknowledge it includes technology. I think that I sort of often am asked, how can you work within technology when it is, like the deep sea rare earth mining, for instance, is directly producing the components that I would use in my work. And it is actually an awkward and difficult question, sort of how do you, what's the balancing act between using those kind of materials at scale, nothing near what the advertising industry would do, for instance, but it is something. And maybe Emma, I don't know how you feel about an artist who's using rare earth materials, at scale. What's your feeling?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think about it a lot. Sadly, I don't think I've got an answer for as in terms of like how I rectify that scenario, but I do think about it a lot. And I was going to ask actually with your LED screens, but it was interesting in the last project you said that it was powered from sustainable, was it from water? I mean, that's really...
Well, we actually worked with community power groups from right across that region. So we got wind power from the Aran Islands. We got different kinds of powers from different places, and we bought it in via a company, which I really insist on, because I just think we shouldn't be further contributing to the climate crisis through our work. Yeah. But actually, just jumping to, sorry, I'm just going ahead here, but one of the questions which I thought was an interesting one was like the most challenging part from back to war. The most challenging part about portraying climate change through art. How do you maneuver between the political opposition about what you are portraying? Have either of you have you experienced opposition?
I mean, in terms of opposition to your work?
Well, I think I mean, have people opposed, climate deniers opposed your work? Have you experienced that?
Not that I've known, no. I mean, I definitely try and bring it into the work, the conversations, the voices into the work. And I guess, I mean, I didn't really talk about in common heritage, but was this like the use of the voices. So kind of the mining companies versus the people in Papua New Guinea who have now actually stopped the mining, happening in their area, which is amazing. But so like, yeah, voices are from all sides of the argument. I definitely try and kind of articulate and bring out in the work. People's response to the work itself, having that opposition, not that I know, but it's quite a difficult one to kind of, especially when, well, it depends, like working digitally, it's kind of to get responses is kind of, unless they're, particularly on social media, I guess, or if there's a conference or an environment, it's often like not as easy to kind of to get those responses. Have you had?
I am often asked the question, which actually kind of bugs me a little bit, which is kind of like, how can you use energy to express yourself? Kind of how can you legitimize or kind of conceive of that? And again, it comes back to that idea of a sort of balancing act between the idea of moving the public, which is one of the great kind of privileges of working as an artist, is the potential that you might move the public and get them to sort of, and move is an interesting term because it's both physical, being physically moved, and emotional. It's like it's kind of this double sort of like two layers. But I mean, Onya, you must have to really engage community to make your work. I mean, you must run into incomprehension as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there are layers of exposure that happen slowly over time, and there's no particular resistance, but there's a slow kind of coming into the work, coming to accept the work, and I actually think that people who like engage with the work by using the work bring their own knowledge to it, so it actually kind of expands and becomes something quite beyond my own kind of frame. So there are these I mean, in a way, what the work is doing and how it's functioning, operating, is completely triggered and developed by its engagement with people, and with people who are kind of much more deeply involved in the landscape that stuff is coming from than I am. So yeah, so that's actually it's kind of much more of a kind of forward and backwards. It's a very much a kind of dialogue, and I'm learning from how people are thinking about and responding to the work.
You mentioned that you paint as a process of thinking, which you kind of sort of sidelined almost, which is quite interesting. I find quite interesting, like with the pigment. And
yeah.
And then have you ever worked with other people working, or like been with other people as they're working with the paint, or is that kind of part of it, or is it very much about the kind of that engagement beforehand and the process of making the paint?
Well, those paintings that, I mean, they're very important to me, and they are absolutely kind of part of the work, but they're kind of moments in the work in which I'm kind of sort of figuring thoughts out, or things are becoming clear through physical engagement with the materials through the making of painting. So actually I found it very interesting that paintings were really telling me things that I couldn't articulate, and doing it in a way that was completely unexpected, but actually, they were also doing something which was quite kind of operating on another perceptual level, and I wanted for the perception of the relationship between the landscape and the color material to be the dominant force.
I'm actually sorry. I'm just thinking back to War's question a little bit. And funny enough, when I released Western Flag in 2017, it did trigger conversations about this idea of responsibility, because a lot of people said, like, why is it a Western flag? You know, it could just as easily be an Eastern flag. And, you know, the original impetus to call it Western flag was, you know, it's from the West. You know, it's like, you know, it's like the, you know, the global, it's more commonly now known as the global North, but, you know, Western values, you know, because like massive oil exploitation really did emerge in America, you know, which is quite significant. I mean, America was the first petroleum superpower. So I would log on to, you know, to different chat rooms or, you know, kind of come across different social media comments and these big arguments, people saying, you know, it's not the West's fault, it's the East's fault, or, you know, it just went on and on and on, you know. So that was interesting to kind of trigger those kind of conversations about like who is responsible for carbon dioxide. Because of course, carbon dioxide respects no borders. It certainly doesn't respect national borders.
I just wondered, back to I'm sorry, had another question which was directed at Emma, and I don't know if Emma was able to see that in the chat. It's under answered, but it's not been really answered, and it's quite a long question. And I wondered if you maybe wanted to read it out, Emma, so that people knew what it was, because the audience can't actually see it, and maybe address it as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I mentioned a powerful speech by Ave Pardo, being a political debate. I was wondering if you know of any video that shows powerful speeches over time paired with a visual backdrop of climate events using the narrative methods you mentioned. I have seen many speeches about climate change. However, I feel like the message briefly gains power but then fades over time, as this is a recurring issue. From your experience, would this be an effective way of showing the issue of climate change has always existed, but our actions sadly have not been aligned to the growing talks of climate change? I mean, yeah, that's literally it. It was kind of, as I read that speech, it although obviously he talks about off the back of the, you know, it's time specific in terms of being off the back of world wars, it was the potential, you know, again, being at a moment of great potential. There's some, you know, it comes with, like the last one I guess I was thinking about is the COP talks, and these kind of like real pivotal moments where there's this chance to kind of like save the world, I guess, and then what happens afterwards, you know. And it's kind of it was kind of really quite a pivotal speech, and that is the idea with the film, is this kind of like this idea of how history kind of repeats and unfolds, and how these we get these moments, and what do we do with these moments, and there can be these incredible speeches, but how we react to that is is kind of, you know, this is an inevitability, sadly, that I kind of feel. That sounds really pessimistic, and hopefully that's not going to be the case, but yeah, I think, yeah, I guess thinking about that in terms of what we were talking about in terms of voices, you know, before, and looping them in again, I was thinking about this idea of speeches and voices and the collective and the individual, you know, very much in the film, as with John and Onya's projects, you know, thinking about these voices and who gives the speeches, and who you know, who's affected, and how, and the layers of voices throughout history. That's gone off on a bit of a tangent, but hopefully that answers that.
It was helpful to me, because I was thinking about that, John, your work was actually part of COP25 and very much in part of that exhibition complex, and I wondered how you felt that had impacts. Did it continue to have impacts? And because all of these talks that we're doing at the moment are pre-COP26.
Well, I think the biggest impact for me was actually meeting an activist from Tonga called Uli Lucy, and we've gone on to develop a project together which will be at COP26. So that was kind of one thing that happened for me personally. The work was not actually at the COP26 conference zone, you know, the blue zone or the green zone. It was at a museum at a slight distance. But there was a couple of endeavors, ocean endeavors actually, that were launched there, you know, so you had sort of policymakers and, you know, sort of politicians and, you know, there in front of the work. And certainly, wow, that was definitely a seagull. I heard a seagull. Definitely, it continues to trigger these conversations about the idea of carbon legacy, which really is a kind of, important, because, we not only do we have to offset, to use that slightly problematic word, our current consumption, we have to address 100 years of kind of vast carbon dioxide production, since the 1901, 120 years since the 1901 big strike, so it's drawdown, like that really is the sort of implication of that, is that it's I would say sort of there's a lot of problematics with offset, so, drawdown, looking at things like carbon sequestration, also looking at the ocean, which is absorbing 80 to 90% of the heat that industrial nations are producing, Actually, the subject of the work at COP26 is about the burning ocean, which is what Ulilossi said to me in COP25. He said, the ocean is burning. Yeah. So I'm making a new sister work to Western Flag called Flare, which I'll show there. Which you are all invited to come and see if you're local in Glasgow. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's this thing that it's hard to judge the impact of the work at a certain point, But certainly it was, a couple of politicians saw it. So I think that wasn't a bad thing.
Well, hopefully some are listening as well. We were going to have a break now, but I don't know, Susan.
There's one more great question.
Yeah.
There's one more question in there, and it's for Onya.
Yeah.
If Onya wants to maybe read it out and address it.
I found that one of the themes in your work was the complicity of art and the harm against the environment. And this is obviously something that you really push against through the deliberate engagement of communities to produce red ochre pigment from the iron ore mines, taking the products of this harm and turning them into products of repair. What are your thoughts on the dichotomy of harm versus repair when thinking about the environment and the role of art within it? I was just thinking actually about Agnes Dennis Wheatfield. I mean, I suppose it's because of John Gerrard's work with wheat and this idea of farming and growing and all the kind of links and connections around that. But I was thinking about how things are repeated and have to be repeated and reiterated and reinforced again and again and again and again. And that, I mean, this is kind of, I suppose this is kind of linking from the question that Emma Critchley just got as well about, how effective are these speeches, are these moments in history, which we think are going to be kind of transformative, and they're not. I mean, we're not going to change the world, and we're just kind of trying to reinforce and repeat and repeat and repeat and say it again and again and again. And so, yeah, I mean, what can we do but just push against and try and change the ways that the system works in a way that creates something that's not feeding back into the status quo as much as it's entirely possible to do that.
And I would also just briefly say, I'm not sure that art is very complicit in harming the environment. I mean, I would put it very low on the list of things that's harming the environment, after society as a whole, and, military exercises and banking and video streaming. And I mean, really, Bengi, we're not top of the list of people who are harming the environment, I don't think.
No, I should have jumped on that word, complicity. I mean, it's interesting. The work of this was another question. I've been asked this before about kind of by reusing these materials, you're just kind of sort of feeding into the same same exploitation, but of course it's not. We're using them as a vehicle, to talk about something completely different, and the scale is absurdly different. You know, we're talking about tiny amounts, and in any case, you know, that particular. I mean, yes. So I think there's something there to be said about the system, the system in which art possibly kind of propagates a certain type of authorship, and or supports a certain type of authorship, which just perhaps, and that's what was my point about Rashid Areen's kind of position of kind of dismantling the kind of, he talks about it as the infantile individualistic artistic ego, you know, and actually kind of working in a much more kind of collective, collaborative way. And I think that's kind of interesting in terms of how we might think about art becoming, you know, not so much about, you know, one person's voice, and but actually much more of a collective force. Doesn't really answer the question, does it?
No, but it gets us further into the debate, so it's brilliant, Onya. I was thinking also about, and then I will let you have a break. I was thinking about, you were talking about repetition, and well, two questions actually. So one for Emma: when you work with sort of 3 distinct communities, and do you keep in touch with those communities? Do you take them with you, and how does that sort of feed into each work? And then I wanted to ask John about repetition.
Yeah, I mean, the projects are often, you know, evolve over quite a long period of time, like a number of years, and therefore I build quite good relationships with the people that I work with. And yes, it does. And often, you know, with Catherine, it developed into another project. I mean, the people, that was slightly different, I guess, in terms of this is the flooding project. The community, I didn't interview the communities that, you know, that was done by the human geographers, and then I was listening to the interview. So I didn't have a direct relationship there, but I did with the researchers, and that has, you know, developed over a period of time. And we've developed another. We developed, you know, research or thinking about another project off the back of that. And in terms of, yeah, of common heritage, I'm still in touch with the scientists, and we still talk about ways of showing the work. We're still, you know, wanting to get the work out in different ways, both within the scientific context and art context. You know, so very interested in, again, having conversations around the work, inviting the scientists that I've worked with, you know, into those conversations is really important, because the situation is evolving, you know, all the time as well. So it's really important to have experts. But I very much, I guess, feel that I work in a collaborative way. It's always about relationships with people that are sustained over a long period of time. And yeah, I had a random question to identify a deep sea creature the other day, and I, you know, emailed 5 of the scientists. They all came back. You know, it's like, so it's really important actually for me to have, you know, good relationships with people.
No, and I think the collaboration with a research environment can cost really.
Yeah.
But when you said about getting the work out, John, I wondered about, you showed Western flag in different contexts. How did that shift? How did the different display context, if you like, alter the work and different responses, or was it kind of a fairly similar response?
So just the different kind of results that came from showing Western flag in different countries.
Yeah, and different types of things.
I think broadly, there was a kind of universal sort of response to the work, which is one of kind of alarm a little bit, that this very familiar thing, a flag, is kind of transformed into something else, you know, because this is a virtual construct. It's a virtual sculpture, you know. Smoke does not behave like that, you know. So it's kind of using this new gaming tool, you know, to kind of make a new type of sculpture. So, you know, people mostly were, you know, a bit intrigued, but also slightly disturbed by it, pretty much universally. I would say that I think probably the most potent place to show it was probably in Madrid, in a way, just because you know, climate warming, not even climate change, but climate heating is the crisis, you know, and that work did speak of its potency to perhaps dissolve the nation state, you know. So you've got all these national entities in Madrid talking about climate heating and not doing very much about it. And then you've got this work which kind of talks about the vulnerability of the nation state in that context. So I would say it's sort of broadly similar response across, you know, the kind of the countries I've shown it in, but perhaps most potently for me in terms of public art in Madrid. Yeah, that's where I felt that it had its greatest potential.
That's great, thank you.
First of all, to introduce Holly, I would just like to say Holly lives and works in London. She actually teaches with me at the Slade. She's exhibited internationally at institutions such as the De La Wall Pavilion, where she actually has a big show on at the moment, the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art, Sharjah Art Foundation, and was part of the Liverpool Biennial in 2018 and the Biennial de Lyon Biennale in 2019. Holly was actually the Rome Fellow in Contemporary Art at the British School of Rome in 2018, so she knows it well, and she was awarded the Arts Foundation Award for Experimental Architecture in 2019. So Holly's sculptures look at the back of things, open cracks where you see the gooey insides. Her work deals with internal and external in terms of the body, display and production, architectural rear spaces, hidden bodily activities, or situations that are brought into view through specific objects, textures or forms. And through scale and material manipulation, she addresses concerns of permeability and morbidity through a visual language that speaks of comic insignificance. And so today, Holly's going to discuss material reuse and regurgitation, taking the idea of detritus as lively matter that can be reworked and reintegrated to develop sculptural methodologies that use natural and waste materials to find new ways of looking and making. I should probably just let Holly actually tell us for herself. So I'm going to hand over now without further ado to Holly.
Thanks, Susan. Just checking you can see that.
Yes, absolutely.
And also thank you to Susan and Harriet for inviting me.
Might need to speak up a little bit, Holly. You're a little bit faint. It might just be me.
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Yes, but maybe just a little bit closer to the microphone if that's possible.
Can't get much closer.
Okay, that's better already.
Okay, I'll speak loudly as well. No, I just wanted to say thank you to Susan and Harriet for inviting me, and also for the speakers this morning for such interesting and rich talks about your practice. So I'm going to speak about two works, but also quite a lot of research and images and ideas kind of along the way. A lot of which actually I thought about, researched and developed in Rome while at the British School. So it feels like a great opportunity to be here talking about this now, an event hosted by the British School. So my sculptures are bulky, weighty, lumpy, occasionally quite noisy things that inhabit the same space as we do. So I think we spoke about it slightly earlier, John touched upon it, but I think it's feels relevant to kind of question whether something like sculpture could be an appropriate medium to discuss sustainability as it uses up things to exist. But for me, sculpture has the ability to tackle things head on, to kind of hold its ground, to take up space. And I also think it has to constantly undo and redo itself. Maybe because I think that's something really exciting to kind of challenge and question its kind of potential, its usefulness or uselessness, really, and the kind of interdisciplinary nature that it encompasses. And I think sculpture in particular has to kind of always rethink its own boundaries and relevance of what it's kind of doing at a specific moment in time, because of the way in which it uses other materials and situates itself within the same space as we do. So my own work in particular looks at these kind of underneath spaces, And I'm interested in this space between kind of deadness and animation, and how we navigate our own bodies as material parts in contemporary culture. I have quite a kind of Frankenstein-like approach to making, where I find myself incorporating parts of old works into new, repurposing kind of maybe shapes or molds or frameworks or materials. So I wanted to kind of start and end this discussion with the idea of loops and recycling and reuse, and talk about that in a kind of larger circular approach to materials that considers when or how they will reappear. And this really comes from my own awareness of using materials, using stuff up, and how to tackle this through the work. Instead of the processes I using just become a kind of background to the work, I want to try and bring them to the forefront itself. So I wanted to kind of frame what I'm speaking about here in terms of specific words that are used to describe digestive processes, so consumption, digestion, reconstitution, regurgitation, and to also frame material processes or approaches that consider sustainability within sculpture as well as my own research. So starting with consumption, this is a still from Jan Svankmeyer's film Food, but I started trying to consolidate my ideas to speak to you by kind of thinking about the definition of this word consumption as one, the action of using up a resource, or two, a wasting disease, such as something like pulmonary tuberculosis. So for me, this word seems to address loss, using up, wasting away through matter, which is something that is very present and physical, what we consume, or referencing the body's fragility if we're mentioning disease. So for me, it's important to kind of use when questioning what the shape of things take when we use them up, where do they go, what are the implications of all of this, which I think the artists earlier have spoken about so brilliantly. This is a detail from one of my works, which is a bite mark out of metal. But I'm interested in kind of undoing material expectations of what materials can be, as well as kind of problem solving being a really big part of my work. So using these kind of material methods and attitudes to address larger ideas of what we use and how we use it. And I truly believe that materials are solutions instead of problems, and want to be able to find ways to solve these problems. So I wanted to start really now with the material of stone, particularly a stone that almost literally speaks. So this is a hunger stone, which is basically an inscribed stone that has started appearing, well, actually reappearing in the Czech Republic and also Central European rivers. So this one's in the river Elbe. So the hunger stone is like a form of hydrological landmark, a rock that was once embedded in the rivers during droughts to mark the water level. But since reappearing now acts as a kind of warning sign to future generations of famine and drought induced hardship. And this is the one that I've been looking at most, which the inscription on this rock translates as "if you see me weep." And I'm interested in this kind of shift between how that can address somebody else, or like if or the rock itself. So like if you see me weep, as in the rock itself crying, or if you see me weep, as in the act of seeing the rock means that people have to be worried or upset. But I've also been thinking about it's an example of a kind of material, in this instance stone, as a kind of re-emergence, a marker of a kind of wider past and future, our past and future ecological problems. But also for me suggest a kind of different way of listening. So I've been thinking about the hunger stone as a kind of slow siren, a suggestion to like listen in a different way to the material perhaps, and a suggestion to think about wider timeframes of materials. A brilliant writer called Maggie Kilgore says, "You are what you eat." And I think about this in terms of, to survive, the body must incorporate elements from outside of itself. So eating being our most material need, combining body and thing to produce vital energy to live. To consume erases the outlines between body and thing, an absorption of objects and that become kind of part of the body. So the act of eating involves a kind of individual and larger social body. So it seems that our edges kind of slip and slide and become kind of turn inside out of themselves in that sense. So to continue this idea of kind of stones showing us things, these are some images of marble inlays, but I want to specifically focus on the Opus sectile method, which is a kind of detailed one on the right, which is a technique popularized in ancient and medieval Roman, the ancient and medieval Roman world, where materials were cut and inlaid into walls and floors to make a kind of image or picture or pattern. So this is a better image of another Opus sectile method, also in Rome. So this method uses fragments of marble and stone, as well as broken discarded pottery or salvaged material to form this image. And sometimes you can see kind of cross sections of those kind of previous histories, so a kind of image within an image. The idea of fragmentation as a tool is continued in this work, which is the 2nd century BC unswept floor mosaic by Sossus of Pergamon and artist Heraclitus, which I became totally obsessed with really while I was in Rome, and spent a lot of time looking at it while it was on display at the Vatican. So it shows remnants of a feast bordered by this kind of strange primordial river of sorts, that it kind of becomes this form of memento mori, really, through the image of the leftover, the kind of discarded remnants that are fossilized or immortalized in mosaic. So both deal with the idea of debris as a significant symbol or material, and it feels significant for me that both are kind of flaws, that association with, you know, inert body, grounded material, or the body's matter. I'm talking about this as well because it relates to what I'm talking about in a minute, but the epilogue of a book by Miles Orwell called The Real Thing, he talks about copies, reproduction, authenticity through the form of rubbish. And he speaks of junk as a system of disorder, but also as a material that kind of gives us a chance to look at something in a new way. So something that's kind of mass produced can then be reworked and reintegrated. Rubbish as kind of containers of association, being the kind of flotsam and jetsam that surrounds our life. So I think about this notion of fragmentation, digestion, incorporation as a kind of fleshy poetry of sorts, when reusing, reassembling and incorporating existing materials within my own work. So this is a work called Slacker, which was made for a solo exhibition at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, titled The Dump is Full of Images, which is the title of the epilogue of Miles Orwell's book that I just spoke about. So the work was made up of 12 aluminium rollers that rotate around that are on a kind of held in place by a framework that rotates a silicon tapestry around the framework itself, and is covered by 2 kind of body-shaped vitrines. And the work really came from spending time at the space at Yorkshire Sculpture Park as it was being built, and to looking at the kind of horizontals of the landscape. The ideas of kind of permanence and impermanence in relation to that, learning about the fact that a large portion of the park was built, the kind of undulation of the park was built as on landfill sites. So this thing that's so much about art and nature, it has also this kind of history of debris under the surface too. But also in terms of kind of permanence, seeing the kind of reclining figures of Henry Moore beyond, and thinking about the recumbent figure in terms of the body lying down in various states of kind of sleep or repose or death. And the kind of the almost the movement and stillness that happens in all these different, very different states of situations like dreaming, digestion, or decomposition. So the work was developed through discussions with Professor Parekh Goswami and his team at the Institute of Skin Integrity and Infection Prevention at Huddersfield University, who they're very integrated in the fashion department there as well, and the textile department and fashion department there. And so Goswami's he's developing these kind of innovative methods for making, well, he was at the time, he's got an amazing catalogue of things he's doing, but at the time he was developing these methods for making replacement skins from recycled plastics, and believes, and like practically demonstrates as well, that anything can be reused and repurposed. So he's doing these kind of pioneering things with textiles, like he's making fabrics from pens, or textiles that filter kidney proteins, or filter dirty water into drinking water, and really kind of showing how that works from what would be otherwise considered waste into something that's helpful and useful. So with the band, I was trying to create this kind of figurative rotational autopsy of sorts. It's like the action is, or the movement is kind of like the life support machine, or implies a kind of process, such as the ones I mentioned before, like eating or digestion. So it was made by, which is a massive part of the work as well, and hopefully kind of was revealing itself through the work. It was made by having this large shallow mold that I kind of cut and drew things into, imagery into, creating what became a kind of surrealist, exquisite corpse technique due to the size of it, where I couldn't quite see what I was doing all the time because I was working back to front. I was thinking about the figure as this kind of collection of surfaces and bits that were held together kind of through the band. So it was made from mainly pulverized plastic or detritus that was left over from other works or parts of other works that I had in my studio, and kind of it was a kind of problem solving technique, in that it also meant that it was bulking up another material. So then it was mixed with silicone as a binding agent, a material that has this ability to take on kind of vivid colours and totally swallow other objects and aggregates. So by taking studio detritus and pulverising the work, it was kind of literally digesting things and going from these kind of full-bodied objects to kind of flat images of themselves as a sort of digestive diagram. And I think it can feel quite hypocritical to talk about sustainability or reuse while presenting a big sculpture made from plasticky parts, but the work came from learning about this attitude of reuse that Professor Parekh has, trying to mainly using existing things in the world, but also speaking about something that addresses materials that almost kind of trick us into believing they're entirely transient, those kind of small elements, that kind of plastic wrappers, fillers, things that, you know, feel quite ubiquitous, but become ever present in our water supplies everywhere around us. So I guess I'm trying to talk about the kind of contradictions between the idea of this disposable nature of the materials and the material reality of these objects positioned somewhere like a sculpture park, where you've got similarly permanent bronze figures outside. So this was part of the process of making it, where I was kind of filling, cutting, drawing and rotating it around. And to kind of go back to the reference of the hunger stones, and ideas of kind of reconstitution or regurgitation or reappearance. Yeah, I've been talking about these ideas of kind of digesting and chewing up and mixing up and undoing. But for me, a big part of it is obviously thinking about breakdown, emulsifying the edges as an opportunity for reassembly. So I thought I'd finish by just briefly also talking about my recent project at the Delaware, which started from the hunger stone research, but kind of developed from spending a lot of time in that specific part of the coast, in Bexhill-on-Sea, on the south coast, and seeing these strange things that were or are kind of revealing themselves in Bexhill and further afield as well. So like this is the wreck of the Amsterdam, which is a ship that sunken still appears, I think it's 8 times a year at specific low tides, as well as the kind of yellow band of smog of the pollution line that appears on cold days. And dinosaur fossils that were being found by all the local people working in the Bexhill brickworks, and the environmental effects of our own kind of waste materials that are obviously accumulating on the shore and become kind of part of the stones and sand, and part of the landscape that's kind of through the natural process of moving and churning. So all these kind of untimely resurfacings, really. So standing on the edge of this land, thinking about these things made me also think about borders of inside and outside, above and below, what we hide and what we don't, and how to kind of interrupt those kind of horizontal or flat perspectives to think about something a bit more deeply than that surface world. So I spent quite a lot of time at the local brickworks, which is just down the road from the Delaware and sited on a fault line within the local landscape, where there's this digging and churning of raw materials that's transferred into building products, which feels like this kind of duality of like the horror of that happening and then the essential, I'm just going to play this video, the essential fact that brick is also needed to build housing for people to live in. There's the brick. So yeah, there was this kind of churning of the raw materials, and then there's also kind of evidence of the byproducts where the waste almost outweighed product weight, having these kind of massive piles of waste things as well. And I saw the brickworks itself as this kind of geographical whole that spat out as much as it swallowed. So for me, this act of digging, seen in the brickworks quarries where that kind of dug up aggregate like filter cake, which was the waste product from the bottom of lagoons, highlights this problem of kind of placing the displaced material, and what Onya was talking about waste, what we do with it when, and I wanted to try and use sculptures to tackle this kind of overproduction and consumption, or at least kind of speak about it overtly. So the works for the exhibition use the waste products from the brickworks, landfill waste as a kind of making material that potentially could have other uses too. A way to confront the idea that kind of trash isn't just away, but kind of confronting it literally too. And one other thing that came out of that is this idea of a worm, a kind of metaphor in a sense. So a material approach and a conceptual approach to these ideas that I was thinking about. So the earthworm became this important way to speak about problems and conundrums and anxieties for me, but also a creature that can kind of signify wider ideas of incorporation, erosion, and symbiosis. So these are just my last 2 slides. So the work outdoors presented the kind of this sculptural worm-like form made from materials that relate to the local coast, so kind of influenced by flood defence methods and erosion control tools, and also waste bricks from the brickworks. The fabric sections were also filled with sand, so there's this approach afterwards where these products that are kind of essential can be emptied out and put back again, so it kind of physically holds the site in a sense. And I think, yeah, for me, the worms are this kind of way to talk about a symbiosis with the ground. Like technically worms improve soil structure, decompose organic matter. And I hope this approach of kind of suggestion of undoing and redoing can embody a kind of larger approach to the reappearance of what we use, and a kind of responsibility within that cycle, which continues to focus on like the response part of the word as something important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly. And that was such a kind of visceral visceral presentation and kind of taking the whole materiality and the idea of mining and regurgitation to another level, but we will talk about that more shortly. Thank you so much. Now I would very much like to move on very swiftly and introduce our next and final speaker, Leone Contini, who is going to discuss his project The Missing Horn, the outcome of multi-located research articulated around specific artificial hills in Milan, Stuttgart, Warsaw, and Berlin. Leone's research can be situated on the boundaries between ethnography and art, focuses on intercultural frictions, conflict, and power relations. His mediums include installations, lecture performances, interventions in public spaces, writing, drawing, and audiovisual narratives. He's exhibited and staged interventions at a variety of venues, including Maxi in Rome, in Dakar, in Berlin, Lyon, Turin, Manifesta 12 in Palermo, the Fondazione Sandretto in Turin, also Museo, gosh, I'm not pronouncing this very well, it was a bit embarrassing with an Italian audience, Museo della Civiltà, Mudec Milano, Quadrenniali Roma, and in 2017, he collaborated with Traces, transmitting contentious cultural heritages with the arts. And in the same year, he was among the winners of the second edition of the Italian Council Prize. And he lives and works in Tuscany, but I'm not sure that that is where he is speaking from today. But without further ado, I would like to hand you over to Leone.
Hello to everyone. Yes, I'm in Tuscany right now. And actually I will, yeah, as you said, I will share some, let's say, visual field notes from this project, the Missing Horn. And yes, it's yeah, it started when this project started when I realized that in Milan I was actually, I thought I was walking in a nice garden park, and I realized it was not so innocent place, but actually it was made of debris and ruins from the Second World War. And since I realized, actually this is a little step back, forgive me for the low quality of the images, but this was even before, this was several years before the project even started sprouting in my brain. This was in Munich, and again I was on a beautiful park, and at some point I followed a rabbit which is down there, and the rabbit, I was running, not running, but following him to the gates, the entrance of their underground city, and what appeared at the beginning as a stones, and I realized later that they were not natural stones, but were artificial objects, small shards and pieces of objects that we all have in our houses, potteries, and I was a bit shocked, and I asked my friends, what's going on? What is down here? Is sort of Pompeii or what? And they actually explained me that the hill was made again with a bombarded city. And then the nature, the trees grew on the ruins, so turning this sterile pile of rubble into a beautiful park, public green space, where the people go to enjoy their leisure time. And this is it's an image of these different hills in Warsaw and Milan, actually. And so in a way, how this is intersecting our topic, in a way, war, I think war is a sort of symbol of the human-made catastrophe, and specifically, historically, Second World War created, was in fact a sort of tabula rasa, which somehow prepared the latest chapter of Anthropocene, and which we are actors of this specific geological era. And so I think what is really fascinating and disturbing at the same time in this places is the fact that nature, what is artificial and what is natural, are very compenetrated, till the point that the trees are, as you can see in this image, somehow embodying or even trying to destroy, I don't know, digesting with their roots all this toxicity. Yeah, toxicity is actually the war is a true epiphany of human toxicity. This is also why I think that this is for me the starting point for this, to approach our topic today. While this is in Berlin, in this image, I think the wood is trying to simulate the concrete of a former military structure that was destroyed somehow, mimetically, like a chameleon. Of course, is my interpretation. And but I have to step back. Why the title? So this project is named The Missing Horn, and the missing horn is exactly the. You see this image. This is Yamantaka, is a Buddhist creature, let's say, and you can see that there is a missing horn here. So this object is in the Mudec Museum in Milan. And why it's the first time I thought was in a very ancient. It is actually ancient, but I thought it was damaged because of time. But then I realized that this object was bombarded. So this sculpture was wrapped in fire after a phosphorus bombardment on Milan in '43, and not only so. This is a Chinese Tibetan Buddhist god, let's say, and these are African weapons. What remains of African weapons that burn in this fire in this. I know it's a bit off topic in relation with our with climate change, but not so much. I think, in fact, that all this environmental discourse should be intersected also with other realms and topics. And I think that coloniality, post-colonial studies, and actually neo-colonial facts are very relevant and crucial for this for us now. I think it's important to take into the discourse also these aspects. Of course, here we are. This part of my research is very much related with the problem, the issue of restitution, because of course here we have the documents that I actually traced back the existence of this sculpture and how it ended up in the hands of the Italian state through private sellers. And here I have all the documents of when the Italian state bought it, and all the list here is the list of the objects that got destroyed in the bombardment. We always think that the museum is the safest place for artifacts, but here we have the evidence that, on the contrary, the museum was a trap where the artifacts got destroyed. First, they were taken away from their context, and then they were destroyed in a fight between European powers, of course, triggered by fascism. So I will go fast, but I just wanted to introduce the context of this research, even if it is not strictly related with our topic. This was the how actually I became a vector of this first step of a sort of restitution of Yamantaka. It was just a vector somehow. Because of this project, and this was actually the project that was the winner in the Italian Council, and somehow this money went back to the sculpture, and here is the exact moment when it was a very important moment for my project, when I managed when I realized that this sculpture was considered sacred by Buddhist communities in Italy, which ignored his existence. It was like a living being, actually. In this moment, was very moving, I think, for me. And then the action was we moved in one of these artificial hills, which I mentioned before, this sort of artifacts that are present in many European cities, created with the bombarded cities. We are speaking about aerial bombardments. And this is a next step again in another such former dump areas. Here you can see beneath the ruins and some vegetation is growing on them. And in this case, I invited other activists and artists based in Italy to comment and to somehow, for different reasons, they were more entitled than me to, let's say, speak about this topic. And so let's go back to here we are in Stuttgart. As I said, I'm sharing with you some visual field notes. And so you have all these shards. This is on Monte Scherbellino, which is a sort of Italian, sounds a bit Italian, is a German-Italian word. Monte Scherbellino, Scherbe is shard. And I was in Schloss Solitude, so it was very near, and I was spending many hours in this very strange place where all these memories were mixed together and digested. I'm quoting Holly. And here are the planimetries, let's say the projects, because to build such hills you have to you need a plan, you know. You cannot just pile up stuff. There is a minimum planning required. And here we are again in Milan. So I'm just throwing images. This is how, when I met a guy that his house actually was burned in the bombardment. And here, okay, here we are in the afterwar time, where this era of opulence was starting. After the war, the destruction, after the tabula rasa was created, so the new world sprouted. You know, the new world of well-being, of opulence and wealth. And Italy was rich for the first time, and the people were able to buy a car, and the ruins were still there in the 60s. Here is the periphery of Milan, and you can see how small now appears this gigantic, actually, pile of rubble compared with the periphery, how the concrete, how grew fast. And so, you know, after the destruction, we have the reconstruction, and we enter the consumeristic era and the last chapter of Anthropocene, somehow. Here we are 10 years later, we are in the late 70s, and the last hippies were partying in the ruins without completely ignoring the existence of the ruins as ruins. I asked my parents, and they said, no, we had no idea. We thought they were rocks, of course, because it's naturalized. I mean, in the Anthropocene, in the era of Anthropocene, a stone, it's natural or it's artificial. You don't know. You really don't know. And this was in the 80s. It was more hedonistic, and the hill was used again by the people. And this is now, no one is around, of course. And now we are in Palermo. And here I think we get closer to our topic because the project was based in different places, because those hills are a bit everywhere in Europe. But in Palermo, I was there for Manifesta, so I was doing completely different project with seeds, and actually very joyful, for me was a very joyful time and very joyful project, because all the seeds were collected through many years of research with farmers based in Italy, but they're from all over the world. And so it was very exciting to see all these seeds sprouting. And this was my project, was a shelter, not against bombs, but maybe against, it was a sort of reflection on the value of difference, okay? So different plants growing together, creating a shelter where we are all equal. But again, the war was intruding my joyful time in Palermo. On the left, you have the This was actually the house of Falcone, the judge that was killed by mafia in the 90s. The house was bombarded in 43. Palermo was destroyed by the aerial bombings. And actually, he actually was killed in the 90s with the nitroglycerin, the dynamite was actually taken out from unexploded bomb lying on the bottom of the sea. And so somehow the violence, this original act of violence, which I consider this sort of epiphany of human toxicity in our era, somehow was there always. Like here, while I was digging in the botanic garden, all these fragments of bombs were popping out. And this is how the seashore of Palermo changed. This is a picture from late 19th century. You see the city was just meeting the sea, let's say. And then this is in the 60s. So you see between the city and the sea, you have a large dumping area full of bombarded houses, and some simply created amusement park there on the right. Now this is a nice park again. So I went, and actually again we're speaking about Anthropocene, and so the first act, the first dump in the very post-war time, just in front of the city, was somehow echoed, somehow was done again and again and again during the 60s especially, and the entire coast of Palermo was covered with dump. So the sea was flooded with shards, with ruins. And here you can see an aerial view on one of those mammelloni, they call them like that in local dialect, these sort of gigantic dump areas. And here how they appear when you walk there. It's dangerous work. It's uncanny dangerous work. And also I brought people there. I'm not explaining you the project. I'm sharing with you some images or some field notes from this project. And here for me was really this image. It's very relevant because it's really it's symbolizing, it's a visualization more than symbolizing. So it's visualizing what Anthropocene is. You know, in geological time scale, this would be the outcome of millions of years of transformations, but the future geologists from, I don't know, maybe from another planet will be very surprised when they will realize that all this happened in few years. Then all this dump is not from the war, but it's from the post-war, it's from the reconstruction, which is the most bloody and polluting in not only the environment, but also the humans in our brain, because this construction was actually, here you can see very well, you see here all these new buildings that were literally created with the concrete and blood, of course not literal blood, but because it was all created by mafia and politicians that were somehow related with mafia. So it's called Sacco di Palermo, the robbery of Palermo, the destruction of Palermo. So imagine all these liberty houses from the early 20th century were destroyed and dumped in the sea, and all these huge gigantic buildings were just popping out everywhere. And here you can tell a lot of material here is artificial, and you also have stones, and nature is somehow, look, for example, this comes from one of these hills, and you don't know if it's natural or if it's artificial. And I even show some of these melted stones from Cerbellino to a geologist, and he told me it's like it looks like a volcano. It's lava, solid. It's like a lava stone, and it was even hard for him to recognize if it's natural or not. And here I have more images, and here it's how the nature again is reappropriating this landscape, this material, and slowly digesting. Is a wish. No, it's a promise to us that all this will be digested in an unthinkable time scale, of course. And these are several, this project ended up in a video, in a film, and I pair different images, chapters from different areas, and you can see different non-human forces are somehow appropriating the structures, and this was a performance related with this missing horn and manifesta both. And this is what looks like a rock is not a rock, it's an artificial sort of structure. Yeah, now this is the last image. How we live on a pile of rubble, we prosperate and we on rubble, but it's also a metaphor of the fact that somehow we are all foreigners on this displaced material. The material displaced, we are all foreigners in time, not in geography, but we live in a mutating era where the climate is changing, and we are constantly thrown into this condition of being foreigners. And so also is how it's pointless to create an identity which is somehow aggressive or xenophobic, while we are all in the same condition of being vulnerable, and at the same time we don't have other choice. This is the soil we need to nourish our bodies. So thanks. I think I made it in less than 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Leone, and that's just such an amazing image to finish on and to finish the presentations on. And there's so much incredibly rich crosstalk. So it'd be great if perhaps all of you panelists could make yourself visible again, and maybe if we just take the screen sharing off and we can get the discussion moving. What really struck me with Leone's presentation was the kind of amount of crosstalk with some of the words that Holly was using to frame her, the kind of regurgitation, the consumption, the detritus, the recycling, and even that kind of last image that just sort of says it all, that kind of sort of mining kind of, there's lots of relationship to the first three presentations as well, but just to start with you two, and please also feel free to ask questions, Onya, John, and Emma, but it would just be really lovely for you to perhaps respond to each other's presentations and what you found maybe in common with it. There were some very moving elements in both. I found the "If You See Me Weep," the stone, incredibly moving, and sort of almost the kind of reverse to the idea that actually having it revealed is kind of a tragedy, whereas in other situations it's the kind of opposite. So it would be lovely if you would like to respond a little bit to each other.
Well, no, I think one thing, I mean, I'm responding after just seeing it now, and so I think we're talking about digesting, and I think there's a lot of digesting that I need to do from seeing Leone's presentation as well. But I was thinking about your technique with your work, Leone, as well as the presentation and your research images of this idea of accumulation. You started by talking about the shards as kind of memories, and then the picture at the end you shown as this kind of build up of stuff. And I think you mentioned this kind of, for me, I'm thinking about it in terms of a kind of human embodiment and environment. So it made me think about kind of, an individual as a kind of aggregate of something larger, which you're speaking about through the images and your work. I don't know if that makes sense, but for me, the power of what you were saying comes in the kind of build up, which similarly I think you're doing with your work as well. This kind of build up of images. It's layers of places, it's layers of history as well. And I think there's a kind of overwhelmingness to that in an awareness that the land, the sea is made of the ruins from before. But I'm kind of interested in maybe asking you in terms of how you're seeing that as something natural. Are you kind of positioning that as something natural, or as kind of integrating together as as an aggregate of something larger in terms of histories. Does that question make sense at all?
You mean how I feel in relation to all these dumps, and if they are inhabitable or not somehow?
Maybe not about inhabitable, but I think it struck me with the image you showed with the kind of brick underwater as well, and you kind of talking about the natural environment. And for me, some of it you were kind of challenging the distinction, you know, challenging where one thing ends and another begins. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I'm a bit ambivalent because I know it's very toxic place, but at the same time I see that the non-human forces are really able to, they have their own agency somehow, and so yeah, it's not natural, but it's reappropriated, and on one side it's somehow the wish, the promise that all this will be at some point digested. Maybe it's more like a wish or a promise, but of course it's toxic at the same time.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I answered you.
It made me think of this incredible essay by Nancy Tuama, where she writes about Hurricane Katrina and the kind of effects of that hurricane in relation to kind of culture and race and class and nature, and the kind of distinction between human embodiment and kind of natural environment as well. I can't do it justice to describe it in a thing, but a lot of what you were speaking made me think of that brilliant essay as well.
And me, on the other side, I was impressed by the hunger stones and as a sort of landmarks from Mark, because also the famine maybe it's could be related with the geological events, for example, eruptions or other climate events. And so I'm imagining the same role played by a landmark nowadays, where the catastrophes are human-made. And I don't know, I have a lot to digest as well.
that feeds straight into a question that Bakhtawa has asked in the Q&A, which is, I think, to both of you. Do you see people responding to these transformations in nature, such as the warning stone or the deserted parks, or do people claim this as part of life and civilization? And how do you make them see that it's more associated with climate change? And I guess that speaks to a wider question of this panel. Is it the artist's job to make people see that, you know, what, so that was kind of one of the wider ambitions of the channel, is what is the artist's role actually in making these things visible? I mean, we're all interested in all the rest of it, but there's that kind of gap. So I'm just adding that back to Waz's question.
I think that from my side, what the hills, for example, are sort of places of remembrance and oblivion at the same time. So in some extent, people don't know what is there. And I don't know if my work is not like addressing from a frontal way the topic. I'm trying to make visible the Anthropocene somehow, to make it tangible. And yeah, but I'm not a climate activist, and I address climate change in terms within Anthropocene, within the.
Leone, if I could just jump in, that word oblivion is really interesting. By the way, we met in Palermo. Do you remember? We were both in Manifesta. I didn't make the connection, but when I saw your presentation, I remembered that amazing garden. But I think what you just said about that, you know, you're not an activist is very interesting, because like surely one of the great conditions of modernity is oblivion, you know, sort of Twitter binging and like Instagram binging and the high street, and, you know, built on the rubble of untold wars. You know, artists point to these things insistently, you know, getting back to Onya, you know, pointing at these great cavernous structures under the ground that are just forgotten, that are kind of releasing huge quantities of material into the world. And, you know, this, what you touched on, which is this layering of war, you know, like the layering of kind of war, which is then everybody's asked to forget it, you know, just put some grass on top and make it a park, you know, and never talk about it again. So it's just interesting, you know, in the context of climate change, that mostly people don't, you know, they come across these works and they are, you know, affected by them, and they are shifted out of the oblivion of late capitalism and this kind of techno consumption, which we're so immersed in. And every time I turn around, I'm pushed back into it, you know, just kind of non-thinking, the stream. It's got a good name, the stream, you know, because you step into it and you're carried away, and you're mostly carried away from any form of criticism, you know. Onya.
I think I just want to kind of add. I just want to mention John Latham, actually, and I think I really want to look at your work, Leone, because you know, and digest it, as Holly said. It'll take some time, but it conjured up this sort of parallel work, which is the work of John Latham and the Five Sisters Bing. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's a work up in Scotland, which was essentially taking the shale heaps. I mean, those images that you showed, very similar structures, and you know, it is the effluents, the stuff coming from the mining, and these heaps that were left, and he was partly sort of commissioned to do some art with them, you know, to sort of, you know, that he was given the question, what should we do with the problem of the waste things? What, you know, what can an artist do to respond to this site? And he said, famously, do nothing, leave them as they are. And so they've been left, and they, you know, he sort of subsequently designated them artworks, and, you know, the kind of rest is history. But the interesting thing is that actually in situ, if you go up to see them, there's no sign saying this is an artwork. There's no sign mentioning John Latham. You go and you encounter these peculiar geometric oddities in the landscape, which I think beg, you know, they beg questions that would they beg questions, just their very presence, and the locals know what they are, but they think of them not as artworks. They think of them as these preserved monuments to the mining industry. So it's like there are these sort of parallel narratives that exist in that particular work, and in many particular works. And I think it's quite interesting that the job, you know, talking of the sort of the role of the artist, well, you know, it's multiple and incidental, and it was a term that John Latham used a lot. You know, he described himself as an incidental person rather than as an artist, and which I think is really interesting. Yeah, so just, I mean, you know, I still have to really absorb your work and more thoroughly, but I just really, oh yeah, and also this wonderful image of the worms, Holly, that these kind of monstrous kind of, as you say, kind of eating, shitting, regurgitating, spewing. I mean, these are the forms, these are the makers of the earth. And I love that image of yours in the Delaware garden, kind of making this very sort of synthetic and kind of cartoon-like gesture.
I think the worm was helpful for me to think through a lot of things because of this act, which maybe we're talking about as artists as well, of like small acts that maybe sometimes can have bigger consequences as well. Like worms undermine rocks and sink rocks and things, and kind of maybe that's a question of, like, you know, actions from artists as well, what these small gestures can do or ask or kind of raise as well, in a way.
And in particular, the gestures that don't come from the artist, but they're actually kind of coming from, if you like, these other activities.
Totally.
Yeah.
because if I can add, often there is a liminal, there's a proximity with activism. Even if you're not an activist, maybe you work with them and you cooperate and you exchange ideas, and then maybe you leave the place, but some ideas were created and have their own life. So this is possible, but it's not, you cannot predict it sometimes.
It's like it makes me think of the disruption that occurs in those two sites that you're both dealing with, the kind of landfill site, and then the idea of it's disrupting, it's pointing towards disruption, which is not, it's different from activism. And activism is much more kind of pointed and directed, whereas disruption somehow sort of suggests that there is no kind of final outcome or answer. We're just kind of jiggling things around a bit.
I really liked something that in the first of these series, one of the panelists, an author, Liz Jensen, pointed out that it was actually, it wasn't necessarily culture's job to do the kind of policy job that we're talking about, but, leave that to the policymakers, the politicians. Well, I don't know that she exactly said that because she was an activist, but she actually said it's culture's job to provide the imagination and to kind of fire the imagination. And it's such a sort of obvious, in a way, thing to say, but I thought it was a really important thing to say. And I think all of you in very different ways are doing that. It's about kind of presenting something in a different way. And you're all also kind of mining history in very different ways. I mean, there's the core, the ice core, and then you've got your compressed one, kind of Leone, and then John's reference back to this kind of early historical moment, Onya kind of clearly, and then I suppose I'm trying to do this with Holly as well, but there is a kind of history in that kind of in that kind of making and regurgitating and recycling and digesting sort of cycle. So I'm just quite curious about how what you all think about that, the artist's role, to fire the imagination in a sense in relation to that, but also what the past can tell us about the future. Sorry, that sounds a bit trite, but all of you are doing it in your really, really different ways. And it would just be really great to reflect a little bit on that. Or maybe you've probably been sparked by what you've seen from each other that might have kind of helped you think through some of what you're dealing with too.
I think one of the things is thinking about, it's quite hard, I think anyway, for us to think about different futures. We often think about the future in relation to what we know, and what we know is the past or the present. And so thinking about different futures or different ways of being is actually quite a difficult thing to do for us. Well, I find anyway that it's always connected with something that we know, and therefore that has already existed. And I think art or artists can be brilliant in helping with that anyway, in kind of like I love the idea of jiggling, jiggling scenarios or situations and kind of going, well what if we can, providing these ruptures and kind of going, well what if we turn that on its head, or we and just putting people into scenarios that are that hopefully can allow a different way of thinking. That it's not that it's potentially that it's just a kind of to kind of spark and kind of provoke things that may be different to the way that we kind of always the kind of general way we think about things. And thinking about, I guess what John was saying, actually thinking about these kind of streams of social media, and kind of that we're all just so tuned into how, like, that's all feeding into the way we think about and contextualize the world that we live in and the future, and actually kind of potentially art can help like throw a spin on that, using those mediums in themselves to kind of make you look at the way that you're, or understand the way that you're receiving the world. Sorry, that's not really asking that answer. It's just kind of a comment, I guess. But I think it's really in everyone's, like you're saying, everybody's doing that in different ways, I think.
And it's also about audience. And I was particularly interested, I mean, so Emma, you talked very specifically about a very kind of cross-cutting, very interdisciplinary, and also just about all of you are working in a very cross-disciplinary way. So you're immediately talking outside the discipline as well. You're sort of speaking to a wider audience than what might be seen as a rarefied art audience. But many of you are engaging with different publics in the presentation of the work as well, which immediately then is you're not, you know, because people can talk to oneself, or we're all very bubbled up, aren't we, in terms of the echo chambers and things like that. But I think just about each of you are reaching out in working in quite public situations, or Emma, I was particularly struck by the work that was presented, and you talk very particularly about the different sort of constituents that were experiencing the work as well. So we haven't got very long left at all, but I just wondered if any of you had anything to say about kind of audience, or I suppose translation as well. The work would be received in very different ways in different situations too.
Well, just quickly, I just think, you know, it's very obviously the situation that we face demands a kind of urgent sort of change and shift in the way that we're all thinking about what making art is, and how it functions, and who it's working to and speaking to and working with. We're entering, I mean, it's like we really are entering into a different world now, you know. There's no kind of like denying that anymore after COVID. It's been like a real kind of shock and sort of wake up, and so yeah, I suppose I just feel like we have to use all the means at our disposal to kind of like, but to not kind of continue in the ways of the past.
And I think given what's just happened, I mean, London didn't get the brunt of it. We thought we saw deluge wasn't actually there, but what's just actually happened in Europe, and what's actually happening, you know, in the Western, North America as well. It's happening now. So I suppose at the end of the last panel, the second kind of in the series, the interlocutor actually asked all of the panelists if they had any particular, I'm going to steal this one because I thought it was very pertinent, any particular hopes for the upcoming COP, given that this is a pre-COP session. So I'm going to put you all on the spot and just ask, what would you see as, what would you really, really hope for? I mean, there's obviously the big hopes, but other kind of specific ambitions. And I know, John, you're actually involved with it. So I'm just curious to know what you're hoping for. And as Onya says, we need urgent action, but where, you know, how do you see that? What do you see as the most urgent thing to address out of all of that?
I would say like legislative change would be the most important thing, as opposed to political rhetoric. You know, we talked about speech making. I think we're at the end of rhetoric, you know, like certainly within my project with Uli, you know, he is going to ask for a legislative change because Tonga is, you know, imminently threatened. You know, it's sort of like, there's nothing abstract about what's happening there in terms of rising sea levels, but also hot seas. You know, the implication of the hot sea is horrific, you know, for all, you know, all life forms. So I would say, personally, I would say legislative change, which is not contingent upon political, you know, concerns.
Any other comment? Because actually we're almost out of time now. Any other? You're absolutely right, John. Any other last comments? So I guess
cultivate intersections between different approaches.
Yeah. Thank you.
I mean, there's so many things, and there's so many things that are way beyond the kind of scope of it, but you know, proper climate justice, end of capitalism, down with this sort of thing.
Well, that's a great note. on that, we're not activists, but we are. On that note, on that really terrific note, I'd just like to thank I've got a few thanks to say, but just first of all, just to thank all of you five, and it's gone far too fast. It's been such a rich, really thought-provoking session. I've really enjoyed seeing the work and I want to see more of it. We could only ever see a slice. I'd like to thank Harriet very much, my co-chair, and also to Marta Pellerini, who co-organised the session with us, but she couldn't be with us today. Many thanks again to the British Embassy in Rome for supporting this series and the collaboration between UCL and the British School at Rome, and also to the organisers of the series, Professor Florian Musnug, who is here but on a dodgy line, otherwise we might have seen him today, who's a Professor of Comparative Literature at UCL, but has also been the UCL Cities Rome director for the past few years and has really been sort of brought about these collaborations. Harriet is one of the co-organisers of the overall series, and also Professor Chris Wickham, who's the director currently at the British School at Rome. I'd like to thank the audience who've joined us this afternoon, and to also just mention that the fourth and the final panel in this series is on Monday. The others have all been on Fridays, but it's on this coming Monday, the 19th of July at the same time. So that's 4 o'clock Central European time, and you work out the rest of the world from there. It's titled Translating Climate Change, so very pertinent follow on to what some of the things we've discussed today, and it brings together contributions from linguists and researchers in the environmental humanities with anthropologists and geographers experienced in fieldwork on environmental problems. So I very much hope that people will return on Monday for that final panel in the series, but I think we're all hoping that this is just the beginning of obviously the beginning of change and action in some ways, but the beginning of further conversations that we could make happen. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and all of those that we can't see as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
And this is the brutal goodbye moment.
It was great.
It's very good to meet you all. Thank you.
He's got those wine. Have a glass of wine, everybody. You've earned it. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.